live from the CME here in Chicago. Bob, good to have you on with us this morning. Crude has seen some kind of limited reaction from the tense situation developing between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia as it relates to the Jamal Khashoggi, the reporter who's gone missing. But Bob, what's the latest? And if you could talk to us about why you think the impact that we've seen in price has been so limited so far.
Well, good morning, Ben. I think actually Bloomberg put it best. They had a headline that said Saudi Arabia points the weapon at itself. And I think that's really the case. This is not the 1970s with the oil embargo that absolutely none of you but me are old enough to remember. The lines at the gas stations, you mentioned our Bob. Saudi Arabia is the dominant oil producer simply because of the speed with which they can take crude oil on and off the market. That's their weapon now. It's no longer the actual amount of crude oil, with the Russians being around 11 million barrels a day, the U.S. being around 11 million barrels a day. Short-term pain, yes, but this is not the 70s where the entire world revolved around Saudi Arabia for close to 65–70% of oil consumption. So it would hurt. I mean, especially where prices are now. If they all of a sudden say, well, you know, you're not playing ball with us in terms of this incident, we're going to take this amount of crude oil off the market. You could easily just turn Iran back on, make some sort of quick deal with them, and then Russia can still ramp up about another million barrels. And Saudi Arabia would suffer greatly from that, both internally and on the world stage.
Yeah, you know, Bob, the U.S. has threatened sanctions, and Saudis responded by saying that they'd lash back, but they seem to be hitting at something bigger when they mention how the kingdom, well, quote unquote, plays an impactful and an active role in the global economy. I'm wondering if these concerns or these comments concern you at all.
Only from the perspective of how important oil is to the global economy. And people have to remember, it's not just gasoline and jet fuel and diesel.
Right.
It's petrochemicals, it's plastics.
Right.
They play a huge role, but they play a huge role as an input. So would prices go up across the board? Sure they would. Inflation would rise. There'd probably be a couple of ticks taken off of global GDP if they actually got serious about this. But the worst sufferer in that kind of a case would be Saudi Arabia. You just look at what they had to do when crude oil went down to $26 a barrel, which is the equivalent of them losing that sort of income that they threatened to take away from themselves. It'd be a difficult thing. I'm not doubting they would do it. I think they would. But again, they would struggle greatly as a country.
Yeah, you know, Bob, while the geopolitics have kept crude somewhat bid, the recent weakness in the indices is somewhat bearish for energy markets. Can you talk to us about how the stock market selling off can impact crude, the WTI, and the Brent contracts?
Well, it's a sort of a component of the whole seasonality times demand based on economic growth. Really, a couple of things that suffer tremendously when you see this kind of an economic sell-off is you can take it down to the simplest common denominator of vacations. You see a lower demand for jet fuel, fewer trips. People don't feel as wealthy. And I'm not talking about just the wealthy feeling as wealthy. I'm talking about the middle class, 50-some-odd% of the country that owns equities. You look at somebody who takes a quick look at their statement at the end of, let's say, August or even September, and they say, wow, I've got this much more money. Yeah, let's take that trip. Let's buy those plane tickets. Let's go to Europe. Anecdotally, I've seen this with family members where they've done so well with their retirement accounts, they're taking an extra trip this year. That's the easiest one. And then that just kind of bleeds across travel and leisure in general, hotels, car rentals. And then again, that SUV is what's the most profitable thing on the planet for the U.S. automaker, so in the U.S. Those sales start to drop over time. It's definitely a domino effect. So when you see equities fall like this, you're seeing confidence fall. And by the way, we're seeing that. If you looked at the University of Michigan consumer sentiment across the board, small downtrend taking place, granted from record highs, but how long can we say that? How long can we say they used to be way up here, which was a record? At some point we got to look at the trend, and the trend for that has been lower as well. Equities does not help that situation in terms of consumer spending.
Yeah, a lot of talk about sustainability in terms of those consumer confidence levels, and possibly what you just spoke to is one of the reasons, or definitely I would say one of the reasons why that RBOB contract's been coming off. Bob, you mentioned earlier Iran and how they could, well, potentially be a pawn in the chess game in terms of this bigger oil and some of the geopolitical uncertainties that we're seeing. I'm wondering if you're hearing of any specific mention of waivers that are being granted to either Iran or some of the nations that purchase Iranian oil.
No, not as of yet, Ben. I'm not hearing anything.
Okay.
Iran is a 3 to 4 million potential producer of crude oil. That's probably the last domino to fall. That's if Saudi Arabia made good on a threat and actually took crude oil off the market. Then all of a sudden you'd see diplomacy, grow wings and Iran come back into sort of the global fold. That's a guess of mine, but it's one of the last dominoes to fall. This particular administration is definitely anti-Iran in terms of their participation in the global market. Having said that, if I were going to take a guess of how this whole thing is going to play out, I think you have to throw a little bit of a realistic view into the conversation. If Saudi Arabia was involved in the disappearance and the alleged murder of Jamal Khashoggi, they murdered their own citizen. There's not a whole lot the global community can do outside of sanctions, especially when you start getting into countries that have done this for years. I mean, what's Russia going to say? Yeah. These things have happened over and over again on the global stage. And I think when Saudi Arabia reaches back and mentions their economic reach, I think that's a veiled statement of saying, look, you all do this, all countries do this. I'm not going to say the U.S. does, but all countries do this. And, enough. We're part of the global economy, so don't make a big deal about it.
Yeah, this is giving traders definitely something to look here and a lot to digest over the last couple days, and I expect that to continue. Bob, I really appreciated a very back-to-basics breakdown in terms of some of the uncertainties that we're dealing with here and tying it back to some of the price activity we've been seeing. Really appreciate it, Bob. Thanks for hustling down and joining us this morning. Bob Iaccino from Path Trading Partners. Now.